Today we're learning about two new kinds of pronouns, the relative and the interrogative pronoun. The interrogative pronoun is something we've been working with a lot just because we ask each other questions all the time in class. So it should feel really familiar, and the relative pronoun looks a lot like the interrogative pronoun, so that should feel pretty familiar too. Let's get going. So we use relative pronouns all the time in English, and we don't really think about them probably, and we certainly don't think about what they are or what they're doing. But these are words that typically are who words, or if it's in the neuter in Latin, they would be which. And sometimes we also use that as a relative pronoun. To have a sentence that has a relative pronoun in it, you have to have what's called an antecedent. And then the pronoun is referring back to that antecedent, that noun that comes before, falls before the relative pronoun. So, for example, you can see in the first sentence, I have a son who is good. So the who is referring back to the son. And this is really my main sentence. I have a son. And then this clause, who is good, is really just giving more information about the son. But you can see that it is a separate clause in itself. It has its own subject, who, a verb, is, and an adjective, good. And while you can see that this particular sentence, the who is the subject, we can have relative pronouns that could be in what in Latin is any case. So I could say, I have a son. This information is the same throughout all of my examples, but you can see that what's happening in the clause, the relative clause we call it, is slightly different in each. I have a son whose dog is good. So this is still referring to my son, but now we're talking about his dog. Or I have a son to whom I read. Here you can see I'm the one doing the reading, subject verb, to whom would be an indirect object. I have a son whom I praise. Again, this would be our subject and verb. Whom is our direct object, but the whom still refers back to the son. Or I have a son with whom I speak. Again, I'm the one speaking, but the whom, the person to whom I am speaking, is my son. The antecedent is always the same. So, in order to do this in Latin, because we have gender and we have case, we're going to need relative pronouns that are masculine, feminine, and neuter, because the antecedent in our sentence could always be something that's either masculine, feminine, or neuter. We're going to have singular forms and plural forms, and we're going to have forms in each case, because you can see here even in English, all of these forms are not identical. We have who for the nominative, whose for the genitive, and whom, to whom or with whom or whom for the objective case, and the same is going to be true in Latin. And of course, for neuter things, instead of saying who, whose, to whom, etc., we'll say which, of which, to which, etc., or sometimes we'll just say, often for the nominative or accusative, that. But let's see what these look like. You can see when we're looking at the forms, what are qui, quai, quod, quius, 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 qui, quem, quam, quod, quo, qua, quo, that these are not unlike our old friends by now, hic, hike, hawk, where we have the nominative is really kind of weird, and then instead of huius, we have quius, and instead of week, we have qui, but you can see these end in I. And then after that, they become much more regular. So we have quem. This is still strange, right, with the E instead of a U, quam and quod, because of course nominative and accusative neuters are always the same, and then quo, qua, quo. And once we go to the plural, these are going to look more familiar too. We have qui, quai, and here quai, which is not unlike hike in the neuter plural of hic, hike, hawk, but then quorum, 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 quibus, 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 quos, quas, quae, because of course this and this are going to have to be the same, quibus, quibus, quibus. You'll see it's not quis, it's quibus. And so that ibus ending, although it's an ending we're not unfamiliar with in the dative and ablative plural, it's probably not what we would expect here. So these forms, like hic, hike, hawk, which are pretty irregular and strange, even among these sort of irregular, strange pronouns, is a pronoun we really need to concentrate on and memorize, because relative clauses happen a lot, and we want to make sure that we're able to identify them and know what job our relative pronoun is doing in its sentence. So if we look at these examples now, these sentences that I gave you before, I've translated them into Latin in what is not a very Latin word order, but just so that you can really see what is going on. So this part, I have a son, habeo filium, oh, that should be habeo filium, habeo filium, habeo filium, habeo filium. Those are all absolutely the same. They're completely regular, just like this part. I have a son, I have a son, I have a son, I have a son. And you can see that in red, I have put our relative pronouns. So these are all our cases. And you can see that the case that they take really depends on the job that they're doing within their own clause. So all of these pronouns are masculine, and all of these pronouns are singular because they all refer back to the son, who is masculine and singular. But in all of these examples, filium is accusative because it is always the direct object of habeo. You can see that it, no matter what the rest of the sentence, this doesn't change. Filium is filium because it's the direct object of habeo. But qui, quius, qui, quem, quo all change because of the job that they're doing in their own clause. So they're all masculine and singular because they refer back to filium, but they are nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, or ablative because of the job they do in their own clause. So qui est bonus, who is good, or quius canis bonus est, whose dog is good, qui lego, to whom I speak, or to whom I read, quem laudo, whom I praise, quo cum locor, with whom I speak. So all of these are going to change depending on how they're being used in their own clause. And we will practice this concept a lot. Interrogative pronouns are, I think, easier for a lot of reasons. Interrogative means that you're asking a question, and so interrogative pronouns are those pronouns that introduce questions. So we're always going to have a question mark at the end, so that's a good tip that we have an interrogative. And we also have one of these words that refer to a person. And you can see that in terms of what they look like, it's not that different from those relative pronouns. And in fact, the Latin forms are very, very similar as well. But you can see who loves you. This is going to be nominative in Latin because the love is directed at you. This would be accusative, but the person doing the loving is in the nominative. Whom do you love? You love whom? This would be accusative. What did you do? You did what? Accusative. And to whom did you speak? You did speak. To whom? Dative. So you can see that this is going to work in very much the same way. The interrogative pronoun forms are not unlike the forms for the relative pronoun. We do, though, only have masculine, feminine, and then neuter, because if we're asking a question about who did something, we don't know necessarily if that who is a male or a female. We're just asking really generally, and so we don't need a separate form for feminine or a separate form for masculine. We always just use this quis form. So instead of qui, we have quis, and in the neuter, instead of quod, we have quid. But then you'll see a lot of similarities. So quius is the same, qui is the same, quem is the same, quid of course is different, but that's because it has to look exactly like this, and quo is the same. So most of these forms are just the same as the relative, and you're going to know that they're not relatives, that they're interrogatives, because they'll come at the beginning of a question. They won't have an antecedent. So here, for example, you can see who loves you? Quis te amat? Whom do you love? Quem amas? What did you do? Quid fecisti? To whom did you speak? Quo cum locutus est? Or we could say qui dixisti, if we wanted the dative. So you can see these are really pretty straightforward, and they really can't be confused with our relative forms. We do also have something that are called interrogative adjectives. Here's the great thing. The forms of interrogative adjectives exactly correspond to the relative pronoun. So we don't have to learn any new forms. And in fact, if we wanted to ask a question in the plural, if we knew that we were asking who did that, and we knew that there was more than one person, we would just use the plural. We would use of the relative pronoun, or the interrogative adjective. We would say qui hoc fecerunt. But the interrogative adjective is when you want to modify something. You want to say what particular thing, and you need a word for that, what or which, and that is going to look just like the relative pronoun. But again, you can't really confuse it because you're always going to have this question mark. It's going to be acting like an adjective, so it's going to modify something. It's really pretty straightforward. So you can say, which dog is yours? Not just what is yours, which dog. We're talking about a particular dog. So qui canis tuus est? Or which girl do you love? Quam puellam amas? Not just whom do you love, knowing that it's some woman, but in particular, which girl? Quam puellam? Or which pirate ship sailed? So it's the ship that sailed. That's your nominative and verb. But this would be in the genitive. It's the ship of a pirate, but which pirate? Quius piratae navis navigavat. So these are going to be like adjectives, but they will also be at the beginning of a question and start a question for. There are a couple of other adjectives that appear in this chapter, and they are included here because what they do is they take these forms of quis, quid, or qui, quai, quod, and they add something to the front or to the end. One of them is aliquis, aliqua, aliquid. This is a pronoun that means someone or something. And aliqui, aliqua, aliquod is an adjective that means some, and then it would modify a noun. So I could say aliqui canis, some dog, right? Or if we wanted to say aliqui porcus, as aliqui porcus, we would say is some pig, right? As in Charlotte's Web, for example. So we could say that. But those are all. This is a noun, a pronoun to mean someone, something, or some as an adjective. The only tricky thing is that in the neuter, it is not aliquai, but just aliqua, which is what you would expect. It's completely normal. Our other pronoun that works this way is one that's called quidam, quidam, quiddam. You can see the double D in there for quid plus dam, or we have quidam, quidam, quodam, which is again our adjective. And this means a certain or a particular. And this is if I want to talk about, oh, well, that particular dog, quidam canis, or a particular woman, quidam femina. But you can see that just like something like idem, eadem, idem, this ending stays the same, and it's the qui part that declines. So it's going to be quius dam, of a certain person, or quidam, to a certain person. So that's it. We really just need to memorize that relative pronoun, qui, qui, quod, quius, 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 etc., and know that for our interrogative, it's quis, quid. And for the most part, if we learn those two things, we really know these forms. Understanding how to use the forms is a little trickier, but that is something that, of course, we are going to practice. So send me all of your many questions, and we'll start looking into relative and interrogative pronouns.